Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry, Peter Shannon, and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
Very clear for us that North America has a culturally very different stance towards technology and opportunity and entrepreneurship than Europe. I think North American market is much more driven by opportunity and try things and also some optimism, I would say, versus where big parts of Europe are much more driven by fear and safety and, what if it fails? What if it doesn't work? The innovators and the early adopters are generally well represented in the US and Canada, so North America. And I think the European airports and airlines are looking towards the US market, and that gives them the confidence to see, okay, it works over there, so now we are sort of ready to try it ourselves. Many of the European airlines, they come from a position where they were a national carrier, right? And so they were basically, to a certain extent, at least a monopoly for a very long period of time. Within the US, just because of the sheer size of the market, the airlines come from more of a competitive background and therefore have a bigger drive for innovation, for efficiency, because they know if they don't, it's going to be punished.
Welcome back to The Vertical Space in our 50th episode. It's hard to believe we're getting close to 2 years since we started this podcast series. And given the milestone of 50 published episodes, here's a quick thank you to all of you guests, listeners, and sponsors who are making this possible. We appreciate all of you who are reaching out to us and supporting our efforts in various ways. Today, we're talking about something that has great relevance to traditional aviation and that will become increasingly important to drone and other AAM concepts as their operations increase in scale and complexity, which is utilization of the most important physical assets in aviation, aircraft and ground infrastructure. We have the pleasure of doing a deep dive into this interesting topic with Christiaan Hen, Chief Customer Officer at Assaia, a company with the vision to improve safety, efficiency, and capacity of the air transportation system by bringing transparency and order to ground operations. We start the conversation with an analysis of the process of turning aircraft around at airport gates, the different parts of the process, the relevant metrics, the various stakeholders involved, and the limitations of existing methods used to manage the turnaround process and broadly gate management. As the scale of commercial air operations increased over the past several decades, with the corresponding commoditization of air travel, the pressure on the air transportation system to increase efficiency while maintaining safety has never been higher. Add capacity constraints at airports that are responsible for the majority of traffic, labor shortages, and the ambitions to decarbonize aviation, and you quickly realize the importance of doing more with less and to do it more predictably and consistently. Most of our conversation with Chris is about how to achieve that. As we discuss the benefits of Assaia's solution to existing aviation stakeholders, we also draw parallels to AAM and how this is a market that will require greater transparency and optimization of ground operations as it matures. Think high-density drone operations, but with the benefit of freedom in infrastructure models and technology stacks that are not burdened with outdated legacy IT systems. We also talk about the differences between Europe and North America as it relates to airport operations, state of the market, and willingness to invest in new technologies. Chris spent his entire career in the aviation industry. He worked for over 8 years at Amsterdam Airport Schiphol in different functions, including airport development, capacity management, and operations management. The last 3 years at Schiphol, Chris was head of innovation for Schiphol Group. During this time, he crossed paths with Assaia. Discussions about a partnership between the airport and Assaia evolved into a partnership between Assaia and Chris personally. At the end of 2018, Chris joined Assaia to become their Chief Customer Officer. In this role, he is involved in both business as well as product development. Chris uses his extensive knowledge of the aviation industry to further enhance the Apron AI Assaia product to make aviation more efficient, safer, and more sustainable. Enjoy the conversation with Chris after a quick sponsor message. This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by uAvionics. uAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let uAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace. Chris, thank you very much for being with us on the Vertical Space. Welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited. It's my first podcast experience ever, actually.
Okay, we'll make it very enjoyable. So let's start with the easy questions. Is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
Related to the work that we're doing, I always like to think that pretty much all delays are avoidable. And it's a bit of an extreme stance that even internally, I have some colleagues that, they won't agree with me because they just have a less optimistic view on things. But I actually think that most of the delays that we're seeing in aviation can be avoided, especially because originate, or not all, but a lot of it originates from the same place, actually.
And so when you say that all delays could be avoided, are you also including weather-related events?
Yeah, that's the weak spot. I mean, ultimately, potentially, if you look what the Chinese are doing influencing the weather, but no, I mean, there's these categories of the weather and security related delay origins, and I mean, that's only 5% together, and the other 95% is, I think, all influenceable to a certain extent. And will we ever get there? Probably not, but I think that's a nice goal to aim for, anyways.
You mentioned, Chris, that they come from the same origin, they originate from the same place. What was that?
Yeah, so if you look at the FAA reports on delays, there's this category on carrier delays, which is roughly a third. And then there's another category that says late arrivals, right? But late arrivals in itself is not a reason for a delay because there was also a reason why the aircraft arrived late. So I believe that typically the bulk of late arrival delays, which is another one third, actually also finds its origins in carrier delays or something else. And then there's the national aviation system delays, which is all due to bad planning and to not enough predictability in order to do a good job in planning. That's another 25% roughly. So I think those three major categories are actually avoidable if we have the right data and have the right tools.
Let's take a dive into the turnaround process itself. Tell us what's involved in a typical turnaround process. What are all the moving parts?
Yeah, there's lots of them. And I think that's, for me at least, the exciting part is that, it's almost like an orchestrated dance. There's so many different people, different stakeholders from different companies that need to perform their part before the aircraft can go again. Because, from arrival, we got, chocks, power needs to be connected, preconditioned air, bridge needs to be connected, cargo doors opened, loaders connected, catering, fueling, and then everything inside the cabin as well. Cleaning, and all of this needs to be coordinated in order to get the best possible outcome, especially because these things are often interdependent. I think an easy example is you won't board an aircraft until cleaning is done. Or if you want to do catering at the front of the aircraft at the same time as you want to load bags there, then you're just in each other's way. But the catering company is a different company than the company that provides the loading teams. If you want to get it right, you need to orchestrate and coordinate all those moving parts correctly.
And what kind of data is used in the process of turning an aircraft around, and where's this data coming from?
Originally, aviation in general, and therefore also the turnaround process was much simpler. Those airports that just had a handful of flights a day, so everyone was always aware of what was going on. But over time, as flying has become a commodity, the required efficiencies have gone up, and we want to do 6, 7, 8 turnarounds per day per gate, and aircraft need to fly as many legs as possible. So the pressure on the system is actually much higher, and therefore the need for this coordination has also gone up. And I think we're still seeing a lot of airlines that either don't have data on these operations on the ground, or if they have them, they're typically the result of manual data collection. So there's literally people that need to press buttons within an application on their phone or need to scan QR codes to log that a certain activity has started or finished. But yeah, there are some issues with that.
Yeah, we'll get to this part of how the process is managed today. But before we started recording, we were talking briefly about the evolution of the pit stops in Formula One and how back in the 1950s and 60s, pit stops would last, maybe 60, 70 seconds almost, whereas now they're 2-second pit stops. So if you look over the last 10, 20 years, or however long you want to extend the timeline here, how has the process of turning aircraft around changed? And what's the most important missing element today?
Obviously, there has been some change, but the key issue is that there has not been enough change. And if you look back how we're turning around aircrafts in the 60s and how we're doing that now, and literally looking at the processes, but also the equipment that's being used, it's quite similar. And given that the required efficiency has gone up so much, I think that's where there's a big opportunity to improve still. And I think the example of the Formula One is a good example where they've really done it right and they've optimized it to the millisecond. And we won't turn an aircraft around in 2 seconds, but I think there's a lot we can learn from Formula One, to be honest.
So at the end of the day, one of the airlines said a couple of years ago, aviation and the airline business is a real estate game. And, those who have the gates win, right? So the gate turn process is so important. I mean, from one perspective, you want to be able to turn it from just the sheer efficiency of the turn to reduce cost. On the other end, if you are really effective at doing it, obviously you might be able to get more gate turns and more gate opportunities throughout the day. And when you can do that, you can increase the schedule. It has an effect on increasing revenue for the airline. It has an effect on reducing costs. But let's step way back. I guess even before the plane is, let's say you got somebody come from SFO to, let's make it LAX. What is involved with the preparation of that plane that's coming from SFO? What is that gate prep at LAX? At what point do they start to prepare for that plane that's coming in? And what's the steps along the way as the aircraft arrives? You mentioned all the different above wing and below wing elements, but if you could talk about that, because my sense is, to answer Lucas' questions, part of this is, since the days of the 60-second turn to the 2-second turn in Formula One, a lot of the improvements that have been made on the airline side could be probably very nicely explained as that plane is pushing off from SFO and arriving at LAX. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the right preparation is half the work. I mean, it obviously starts with the planning, right? So how many flights are you expecting on a day? How does your resource planning look in conjunction with that? And then on the day, how are you planning that staff according to when these planes actually arrive? And the better you know when the flight is arriving, and then with better, I mean, the more predictability you have, because even if it's late, as long as you know in advance, that's not necessarily an issue because you can still adjust without having a negative impact. So yeah, you need to have, the people and the equipment ready stage. First of all, the gate needs to be available, right? So if the previous flight was delayed, you want to know that early on so that the next flight, the one coming in from SFO, is not having to hold, but it goes to an alternative gate, for example. The gate needs to be free of any GSE or equipment or even FOD, so that when it arrives, it can basically directly taxi onto the gate. So there's a decent amount of planning and preparation required for that to basically have a smooth arrival of the aircraft that the turnaround process itself can start on time.
I will put a plug in real quickly for companies like Pastor Aerospace that give, really good and very exact ETAs. You mentioned the schedule is one thing. Anytime there's any change to that schedule, knowing exactly what that time is plane coming in is extraordinarily important. And there's many companies that do it, but I know Pastor is often been referred to as the best, and I am partial. So the plane is coming in, you know almost to the second what time it's coming in, and then just explain those steps as it's getting ready when, and why is this coordination so important? Talk about it both from the perspective of the arriving aircraft, but also from the perspective of what's going on within the terminal. What's going on as far as the people who are getting ready to go on that plane, because I know it's a kind of a two-way street there, isn't it? And you've talked about in the past, this has been manual. You also have implied some of this is being automated.
Yeah, it's having people ready and resources ready. And I think a good example is, you need a jet bridge driver to connect the jet bridge still. I mean, there's initiatives underway for automated jet bridges, but we don't have them yet. And this seems like something that's doesn't matter too much. But if there's no jet bridge driver, nobody gets off the plane. And that arrival delay will result into a departure delay if it takes long enough. So the people inside waiting for it to get on their flight are going to be impacted if that person is not there. And there's a lot more of these examples, right? Because if there's people that have reduced mobility on the plane, they need to have wheelchairs on arrival. Because if we don't get these people off the flight, again, that will impact at some point the departure leg of that flight. And this is, on-time performance all related to passenger experience. But I think there's another angle as well for sustainability, for example, because as the flight comes in, it will have its auxiliary power unit on, which is a generator that creates energy for the aircraft. And the idea is that after arrival, you plug in the ground power so you can turn off this very inefficient generator engine in the aircraft. But what we often see is that this happens very late into the process or sometimes doesn't happen at all. And that means instead of using potentially green energy from a ground power source, the aircraft is running its APU engine, which creates carbon emissions, which creates noise pollution, and therefore not being ready to start the turnaround and not being ready to start handling the aircraft also has a negative sustainability effect.
From an operations standpoint, is the turnaround process more about shortening the duration of the turnaround, or is it more about enabling the airline to be accurate in their prediction of when the turnaround is complete and when that aircraft is ready to go? Given that this flight has a cascading effect throughout the rest of the day for where that aircraft is going to be used and all of the other interdependencies in the airport ground environment and in the air routing environment. Which objective dominates in the operations aspect of the turnaround?
That's a great question. And I would say it differs a bit on what kind of airline you are, if we're talking airlines now, right? If you're a low-cost airline that typically flies passengers point to point, then shortening the term as much as possible upfront, so having the shortest possible scheduled turn time is key because the aircraft will be flying more and therefore creating more revenues. If you have a more traditional airline that has a large share of transfer passengers, it might be different because it's part of a hub and spoke system. And winning sometimes somewhere might not mean you can fly an extra leg because it's a flight. It's either a long haul flight or it's a feeder flight, and therefore that benefit might not be achieved. But that's about the scheduled turn time. So once you have a scheduled turn time, then I guess it's all about making sure that you don't catch a delay relative to the scheduled turn time. And again, being able to depart early, there's cases where it could make sense, but I would say it's rather about just reducing delays and leaving on time than trying to leave early, which you often can't because of passengers that are not expecting or anticipating that.
And I guess a delay has different impacts. One is the direct operational impact on the airline and the use of that aircraft later in the day, and the other is the perceived impact by customers and for their individual flight, whether they are significantly delayed and what that means from a customer opinion standpoint. But for turnarounds where we are trying to keep the aircraft on schedule, where we're trying to minimize the amount of time consumed in the turnaround, obviously a lot of steps happen during the turnaround. You have a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in making that happen. Where are the bottlenecks in that process? Some things like baggage handling or those aspects have slack capacity there at the gate. Others like catering might be capacity constrained. And if there's a delay that causes a bunch of flights to come in at the same time, maybe the caterers are capacity constrained to get the food to all of those different flights. How does that look at the typical target airports and airlines that you're working with, where those bottlenecks are?
I think the key word or the key concept here is this critical path. So there's some activities that even if you're late, it doesn't hold up everything else. So at some point, it will still become a problem if it's delayed for very long periods of time. But especially those activities that have dependencies, those are the ones that are typically driving delays. And again, that might differ on an airline per airline basis. So for example, we know there's some airlines that won't board passengers until they've finished the catering process on the front of the aircraft because they don't want to have the door opposite to the boarding door open at the same time and have the catering operator loading the carts as passengers are boarding. If that's the case, there's a dependency there, and you will wait with boarding until that's finished. And therefore, if that catering process is late, they will have a knock-on effect inside the turnaround. Another example is fueling, for example, where on an airport per airport and even airline per airline basis, there's different procedures around fueling. So some airlines, again, they won't board an aircraft until fueling has finished. Others will say we'll board the aircraft, but it needs to be supervised by the fire department, or people are not allowed to put their seatbelts on. But again, if they won't board until fueling is completed, there's a dependency that's a potential source for delays. And another one is cleaning. So typically, you need to have the cleaning process finished before you can start onboarding the passengers for a departure flight. So it's typically those kind of processes that are on this critical path that have the highest chance of creating a delay.
Couple different paths we could go here. Just really good question by Peter. So one is is it important to turn it fast, or is it important to turn it a lot, almost in a way, as Peter was what you were asking? So it partly depends on schedule or off schedule operations. If it's on schedule, you want to be able to turn it within the time frame that you've been allotted. If it's off schedule, you want to turn it as quickly as possible. I mean, just the other day, I was picking my daughter up at the airport, and I saw that she had a plane going into LA that it was really delayed, and it was her plane that was going in. And I wanted them to turn that bad dog as fast as possible, because I knew if it did, that would allow her to be able to take off on time. And I think it was a Delta plane, and boy, did they turn that fast. Frankly, when I saw it was Delta, I thought they are so good at this. They're so good at the turns, and they turned it really quickly. So in that example, Peter, they turned it fast because it was off schedule. They got it out quickly. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and Chris, you were referring to it earlier, I love the idea that, listen, if you get really, really good at it and you can count on it and it's predictable, then I can get more gate turns throughout the day. And then that affects the schedule. Peter and Chris. Now, if you can affect the schedule and you get more turns throughout the day, now you're affecting the revenue piece of it. That's why this is such an exciting topic. And we've had many guests. Pasha, for example, from Alaska, talked about the importance of the efficiency of the gate turns. Alaska is very good at it as well. All right, so I have not asked one question out of that whole little few minutes soliloquy.
No, but I'm sorry, but I couldn't agree more with you, because you also said earlier it's a real estate game. And to be honest, it very much used to be. The problem today is that many airports are running out of physical space to play the real estate game. Airports and airlines, they need to look for different solutions to get more turns per day out of the same amount of infrastructure. So it's really bricks and bytes these days.
So that being the case, and that's why we're having this podcast, it's so interesting. And also there's an advanced air mobility component here that we have to talk about. We have to talk about in a few minutes, electric planes, what's the requirement for, charging, how would they charge? Because that's going to add an element of, I'm going to call it opportunity, but also complexity to the process. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes, Chris. The one other thing that hit me, that whole process that you just described, above wing, below wing, the passenger component and the like, there's a lot of different organizations involved. When my daughter's plane had to be turned, that wasn't just Delta Airlines. Now, I should say, it depends, right? Some airports, Delta may control almost everything. And at some other airports, the airport is involved. The FBO may be involved with the refuel and the like. So there's a lot of different organizations that are part of that turn. How is that managed? And I don't want to ask a leading questions to what your company does, but how is that done? What kind of collaborative processes are involved, and what kind of visibility is involved for all those different players?
So we see obviously different models, but I think there's general consensus that you need a certain level of control, operational control. So in the airline, even if they've outsourced many of the actual turnaround activities or turnaround processes, there's typically someone who works directly for the airline that's in charge of the turnaround process as a whole, or is responsible for the on-time performance of flights. This is either a turnaround controller or departure manager. They have different names. And there's very different models there. There are some airlines that literally have one person per flight, on the gate, manually overseeing everything, which is obviously a very costly solution, because you need a person per departure, and you have departures sometimes around the clock, so these people work in shifts. So that's a very costly role to fill, and more difficult, especially with the staff shortages that we're seeing in the industry. Then other airlines have more sort of efficient models, where they, for example, use zonal managers. So that's a person who's responsible for departures in a specific zone, which can be a terminal or a pier or one side of a pier. And then there's, sort of a full remote kind of model where all the turnarounds are basically managed from a remote location, from a central operations center. And we've even had one airline that we've seen move from the one extreme where they had one person per departure and tried to move to the centralized model. They didn't have the right tools and the right information and data to be able to do that. So they saw a massive drop in their operational performance. And as a result of that, they needed to move back to the original model. And now we are working with them to try and help them to move back again to the more efficient centralized model, but by actually providing them with the tools and the data to, even in a remote location, have visibility in real time about what's going on, to be able to be alerted to deviations from the desired process, and therefore basically, control your operation. A phrase that we really like is you can't manage what you can't measure.
So on that note, whether this is a person at the gate or in a zone or just a fully remote model as you described, what is it that these people measure today, and how does that measurement, and I'm thinking perhaps off block time and certain other predictions, how does that then propagate throughout the rest of the air transportation system?
Yeah, so I think there's, like you say, there's two things. There's one, measuring when individual activities start and end, and the second thing that they're typically involved with is trying to estimate when are we going to be ready for departure. And if we look at the performance of these human estimations, they're unfortunately not very accurate. And to be honest, that's not even strange, because these people are doing many things at the same time. And even if you're as a person at an aircraft and you have one person per departure, if that person is on one side of the aircraft, you won't see what's on the other side. If you're inside the jet bridge, you also don't know what's going on outside. So even though having a person at a departure sounds like, you got eyes everywhere, you typically you don't. And therefore making these estimations continuously is anyways impossible, because you're doing other things as well. But making accurate estimations based on knowing everything that's going on is definitely challenging. And furthermore, what we're also seeing is, as a result of the staff shortages, which again are a result of many airports and airlines laying off staff during the COVID crisis, we're seeing that the people that are there today are typically less experienced. So whereas before you would have someone who would be working for the airline or the ground handler for, 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years, and just by the smell of the kerosene, they would know that the aircraft is gonna, be 3 minutes late today. These people sort of, were laid off or left the companies, and the new people come in a period where there is a staff shortage. So training periods are cut. They don't have the experience, but they're required to do the same job. And obviously they're not as good as their more experienced colleagues that were there before.
Chris, let's talk a little bit about the integrated software that's used to be able to coordinate the process.
And that's something that we are offering the industry. But before, there really wasn't. And that's, I think, the hole that we're jumping into. So what we saw before is that each individual company that plays a role in the turnaround, they will schedule their resources and they have their plannings, but there was no integral view of who's doing what at which time. And I think now, for the first time in aviation history, we're solving that. And we're using exciting AI technology to basically create a comprehensive overview of everything that's happening in the aircraft turnaround process, regardless of who's responsible for actually doing the task or activity.
Who else provides this kind of software?
Yeah, there's definitely different companies, involved in resource planning, but also in creating the data about the different activities.
Mm-hmm.
It's a relatively new development. Before, this was all manual data collection, literally people manually creating timestamps. And now, for the first time, this happens in an automated fashion because of developments in computer vision that have made this technology a realistic tool for this use case.
So explain then how it works. And also, you mentioned AI. Is that a dream that AI would be applied to the turn, or is it a reality today? And how is it?
So we're already seeing that. So we're already doing that today. How this works specifically for us is that we're using computer vision technology, and airports are environments where there's loads of cameras out there already, right? So we can use that existing camera infrastructure. We don't need to put in any special cameras or new cameras in many cases. So we tap into these existing cameras, and the software can then basically analyze the video images coming from the cameras and detect the different turnaround processes and events. And that specifically is AI technology that's already at use today, at many different larger airports in the world, like, for example, Seattle Airport.
So you got to give people a little bit more than that, because so what you're saying is there's CCTV and different cameras around the airport. Some of it may be owned by the airport. Some of it may be owned by the airline. So they have rights to that data, I'm assuming, from the cameras that have been installed. You're getting the feeds, and then you're applying AI to those feeds. Paint the picture for our guests what you're doing to that, because that's a very cool process. And then what are you doing? What was done before when you weren't applying AI to that kind of the data stream?
Okay. Yeah. So before, really, people were either looking at videos themselves and manually recording times. And this still happens at many airports in the world today. The technology we use is very similar to what you would have on your phone in your photo library, right? So typically in your photo library, you can basically tag people. And if you enter someone's name, your photo library would show you all pictures of that person. And the underlying technology, which is computer vision, it basically recognizes people in your entire photo library based on you tagging them. And that's actually exactly what we're doing. It's just that we're not tagging people, but we're tagging jet bridges to connect to an aircraft, or cargo doors opening, or catering trucks coming onto the stand, or fuelers connecting to the wing of the aircraft. So as all these things are happening in real time, we are basically creating a timestamp for those activities. And then the product that sits on top basically shows users everything that's happening in the turn. So regardless who's actually performing the task. But more importantly, we rely on alerts to basically signal situations of interest to the user so that they don't have to oversee all operations, but that the software can actually pull them in on those situations where an action is required. So you can imagine that these people become much more productive, because rather than trying to oversee all the operations, the system does it for them, and they're only being pulled in as there is a situation that requires an action from them.
You're ingesting data from the cameras. You're ingesting data from people predicting what time the plane's coming in. So you're ingesting an awful lot of data. That's your platform that's doing that?
Yes, it is.
And then you are conducting the AI on the film, and you're seeing what would otherwise have been done manually. And probably a lot of those activities are being missed. But with you, it's automated. You're doing calculations on, I assume, the critical path, and then you're feeding information back to, you said, the users. Describe the users. How is that information going out to them? How are they being updated? And then what are they doing different, Chris, based on that information you're sending to them?
I think a good example might be an airline user that works in an ops center. This is a departure coordinator. And previously, if for one of the turns that this departure coordinator is responsible for, let's say the catering truck didn't show up, or didn't show up when it was supposed to show up. Previously, the departure coordinator would only learn of this as the cabin crew would at some point say, catering is still not here. And they would go to the captain, disturb the captain during his pre-flight check, and ask the captain to radio into the ops center to report this. So by the time this departure coordinator learns that the catering truck isn't there, they already lost 10, 15 minutes, right? And then this person starts to chase the catering service provider to ask where they are and if they can come as quickly as possible. Now, with our system, we see in real time when a catering truck is or isn't there. And we have the logic for each individual airline to define when it should be there. So as soon as it should be there and it isn't there, we alert the departure coordinator that can take action directly. So we take this 10, 15-minute latency out of the equation, and we allow the departure coordinator to be much more in control of the flights that he or she is responsible for. And she can act directly towards the catering service provider. And at the same time, they can be sort of like an information service provider to the captain and say, sorry, catering is late for your flight today. They're on their way. They'll be here in 5 minutes. Right? So even the working relationship between all the stakeholders improves as a result of this improved visibility of what's actually going on.
And so then as a result, what's happening? We talked earlier about what's really important to the airline, with off and on schedule operations and the like. So is there a lower cost to the airline for being able to conduct these activities? Is that the primary benefit, or is the faster turn the primary benefit? What are the results? Getting back to Luca's question, what are the metrics that are improved for the airline as a result of the process you just outlined?
Yeah. Let's make it full circle. So I think the key benefit in this example is definitely the on-time performance, right? Because if things go wrong and you start fixing them with a 10, 15-minute delay, whereas your scheduled turn time might be 45 minutes, that is going to have an impact on on-time performance. And we've actually proven with multiple airlines that we can, on average, improve their ground delays with 4 to 5 minutes as a result of them being more in control of their departures. Or reducing the delay for the airline is a cost benefit on one side because there's a cost to a minute of ground delays or cost to a minute of delays in general. It also is a revenue opportunity because if you can shorten your turns, reduce the buffer between turns, you could potentially do more turnarounds per day, as we mentioned before. And then for the airport, they can handle more flights per day per gate, which is also a revenue driver on the airport side.
So tell us a story, how this all came together for a given airport or a given airline that you've worked with, and the observed advantage that this data and approach gave, and how that fit into the bigger picture for that group.
A good example, and you guys mentioned Pasha before, who I know was on the podcast as well. And we do a lot of work with Pasha and with his team at Alaska Airlines, and they've benefited from our technology to reduce their ground delays with 3.9, so roughly 4 minutes on average. And that's one example of how we drive value for airlines. There's definitely other ways as well, like on the sustainability front, where we can help them identify where, as I said before, ground power is not connected directly after arrival. Sometimes that's an issue with the infrastructure on a specific gate. And just by having all the data about all your operations, you can all of a sudden get these insights that drives value in either cost or in sustainability or even safety, because there's standard operating procedures for each airline that typically prescribe how things should happen. And then traditionally, there's auditors that go and do visual checks if the operating procedures are being followed. We can automate those. So we can not do only spot checks, but we can literally check 24/7 on each turn if those standard operating procedures are being followed. So all of a sudden, you have the super rich safety database where you can do root cause analysis and find out actually why people are violating certain safety rules, just because you have enough data to dig that deep. So I think that's another way where we can also drive value on the safety side of the house.
Before we talk a little bit more about your company, let's talk a little bit about the electrification, let's say, of aviation. How is that going to affect the turn process? What has to happen to the gate turn process with more and more electric airplanes being introduced to the system?
Yeah, that's an exciting question. I'm not sure I have the full answer on that one, but charging is obviously a challenge. There is developments into new battery technologies that should allow for quicker charging, but the gate capacity at many airports is a limiting factor. So it's in everyone's interest to have the planes on the ground as little as possible. So if the charging is going to take longer than turnaround processes are in general taking today, that could potentially be an issue. I'm personally not aware exactly of what kind of times are being estimated for charging planes, but there's definitely some challenges there that need to be solved, I think.
Chris, who benefits the most from improvements in the turnaround process? Is it airports? Is it airlines? Is it ground support services providers?
So I won't make a choice between airports and airlines because I really think it's on an equal level. But definitely the key value sits with the airports and the airlines. This also depends a little bit on the operating model of the airport. Like you have the US model where it's slightly different, but for airports, capacity is key. And expansion is expensive, it takes forever, and is more and more physically impossible. So the only way for them to grow is to become more efficient. So that's really on the airport side. And I mean, for the airlines, it's like we discussed, it's the cost of delays, but also being able to fly an extra leg, right? There's many airports that don't even have night curfews, which might mean you cannot fly an extra leg because you're 20 minutes short in the end of the day. Oh, if we can shave off a few minutes of each turn during the entire day, then you might be able to fly that extra leg. And that's a big step up in additional revenues.
From an operational risk management perspective, in real life, how do airports and airlines make the trade-off between sticking with existing methods that are well known and then adding some kind of a buffer to their processes so that the entire network works, or investing in adopting a new technology that promises to reduce errors, but at the same time might open up new kinds of risks?
It's I mean, what we see is, like, obviously they come from buffers, right? So there is a certain amount of uncertainty, unpredictability, and the traditional solution for this is buffers. And since that's the status quo, there is definitely an amount of change management required in order to make people see and make people believe that there's an alternative approach, because buffers are extremely expensive capacity. So it's I think it's our job to show to the industry the potential of looking at things in a different way, and to use data and technology to improve things like predictability, and then also showcase what kind of impacts that can have on the way you run your operations. And I think we're well on our way, but we also still have a long way to go.
Just talk about the market that you're in, and then what's the total available market for companies that are helping to solve the gate turn process?
So the entire market is not extremely big. I said we're a software company, and there's many other software companies that are in the B2B sphere that, as potential customers, have every other company in the world. For us, because our customers are airports and airlines, and there is a certain size of airport or airline under which it doesn't make sense because you don't have the operational pressures to benefit from our system. The market is somewhat capped. We're typically talking about sort of the 300 to 400 largest airports in the world as being our main direct target group. And there's different providers of turnaround management solutions. But what I think is interesting is that a lot of them, they focus on optimization. However, you can only optimize well if the data that goes into the optimization is there and is accurate, right? So I think gate planning is an interesting example where you can have, state of the art optimizer that automatically finds the most optimal gate plan for an airport for a day given a certain flight schedule. If that optimization that assumes arrival and departure times for each flight, right? If those are off, then the outcome is still going to be, so it's garbage in, garbage out. I think where we come from is the data side, where we say, we can create accurate data, accurate predictions, and from there on, try to optimize things like the turnaround and potentially a gate planning for an airport.
Luke asked a good question earlier, which you answered. It depends on the model. He asked, who cares the most and who benefits the most. You mentioned you have the U.S. model, which is essentially, the airlines benefit because generally speaking, they manage the gates. Although there's many exceptions to that, right? There are U.S. airports where the airport manages the gates. Although the ultimate beneficiary, probably without exception, is the airline. Internationally, that model changes a little bit, where and you know a lot better than I do, but the airports very often manage the gates internationally, although the ultimate beneficiary is the airline. Have you ever had a situation, you said there's, the market's about 400 or so, but I'm assuming when we get electrification, when we get the eVTOLs flying and the like in the next 5-10 years, there's going to be turn processes, opportunities there for you there as well, I would assume. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so. To be very honest, it's not something that we are actively looking into or working on today. We have our hands full on helping the traditional aviation industry transition to a more data-driven state of mind. But absolutely, I mean, it is going to create even more interdependencies between extremely close transport modes, medium-haul transport modes, and long-haul transport modes. And therefore, the system as a whole is potentially going to become even more complex and intertwined. And that means that every single piece of that system will have to work efficiently for the whole to function.
How well those aircraft, the eVTOLs, turn could be a function of whether that was a profitable route or not. Getting back to Luca's question of the risk and the beneficiaries and the like, have you ever been able to work out a pricing model? I mean, at the end of the day, we talked about some really significant cash generation for an airline as a result of this being done effectively, especially if you can get another gate turn in right during the day. Have you been able to ever work a model where your pricing is a function of the ultimate value to your customer?
Honestly, we'd love that. And we've proposed that in the past. But unfortunately, until today at least, we haven't found a customer that is willing to go for such a model. The main reason we've pinpointed so far is that, I mean, procurement departments have a more traditional view and they like predictability in the cost that they're engaging into. And this model doesn't allow for that. But I mean, to me personally, it's an absolute no-brainer. And we've heavily pushed it, especially also during the COVID crisis, where the no pain, no gain kind of model. It makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah, you've mentioned some names already from airlines who are super sophisticated people who may be willing to look at something like that. That's an exciting opportunity. You both win, or neither of you win. But it sounds like what you're doing is pretty interesting. I'm assuming there's a lot of other companies to do something maybe similar, but it sounds like a cool opportunity. So tell us about your company. We already know kind of what you do. We already got a sense for what the value is. Just tell us a little bit more about the company.
Yeah, I mean, we're still relatively young company, as the solution that we're providing is also still relatively young. We've been there since 2018. We spent the first year or so really working out the tech. Second year, 2019, developing the product. We did pilot projects pretty much all over the world. And then as we were going into 2020, thinking that delivering all the projects that we were expecting to sell was going to be our biggest headache, we entered the COVID crisis, which put us a bit in a holding pattern. But we did sign our first few big customers before that. And if anything, it did give us the time to sort of properly implement the necessary processes to be able to implement near mission critical software at large airports with many stakeholders heavily intertwined and integrated into other systems, as well as further develop the product. And since 2020, and especially this year, we're really seeing that the industry is bouncing back, that the willingness to invest is again there. And what we also quite happy to see is that the concept of using artificial intelligence and computer vision in order to track the turnaround process and all the benefits that this can generate, the maturity of that concept has evolved, even though there was the COVID crisis. So where the excitement that we saw back in 2019, 2020 was very big, it was still also met with a lot of uncertainty and questions. And I think the interest that's there in the market today is much more solid. So when we talk to customers today, it's no longer about does this technology work or can we actually get benefits by having this. I think that's a very big differentiator between them. So European company, we have a headquarter in the US, a global presence. We're about 50 people. We're an aviation pure play. We got a lot of kerosene junkies on the team. Yeah, if anything, really excited about what we do. We believe in what we do, and we really think we can make a big difference to the industry's run.
Just give us a highlight of the other leading providers in the turn process. Who are the companies and what do they do as part of the turn?
So from our perspective, companies that we really like to see and work with is for example a company like Springshot. They have an application that's also focused on turn management, but they're different from us in a way that we really focus on the data generation part, so bringing the data about the turn, whereas they really focus on the collaborative aspect. So their application is really focused around facilitating a chat and communication between the different stakeholders, which is not something that we're very strong on. And we've been working with them for quite some time, and it seems that we finally have some joint projects coming up as well. It's a really natural match of two companies with their core characteristics. And on the other side, there's companies that are really good at resource planning. But as I said, if you want to have an optimized resource plan, the underlying data sets are really important. So companies that are really good in resource planning are also really good natural partners for us and companies to work with, because they can shine in the way they optimize resource plannings, whereas we can shine in creating data and insight about what's actually going on.
So Christiaan, one of the insights here is that the company really has to master how to bring the solution all the way through for the customer. It's not just the technology, but it's navigating how to deliver that benefit through to their bottom line. What do you see broadly as what's required in order to do that in this space, or how might that look for other parts of aviation like advanced air mobility, where we might head next?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. Like, we cannot just deliver the technology and step back. And that's especially because it's something novel to most of our customers. So we have to work both on the operational level to ensure that there's adoption by the people that need to work with the solution, as well as work on a strategic level with management and executives in order to make sure that they understand the value that they're getting from it, and also sometimes make them understand the changes that they need to go through. Because sometimes it's a different way of working, whereas it used to be much more reactive. We wait until somebody radios me there's a problem and I start solving it, where we try to make people more proactive to sort of start fixing problems before they arise, or at least in the moment that they arise. So that requires quite a bit of change management, and that's definitely an activity that costs us quite a bit of effort, but we're seeing that it pays off. And we also believe that if we start having the examples and we can share those examples with the rest of the industry, that ultimately it's a kind of a snowball effect. And I honestly believe that someday in the next 1 to 3 years, this will become common practice. And with regards to new developments, it might potentially be easier because there's no legacy. We even see that in operational teams in our user groups, where people have been doing the job for forever. They have a much harder time changing the way they work, where someone who comes in fresh, they don't know any better. So as long as they're being trained properly, they don't have any resistance. They don't need to change. They just need to learn the job in the new way. And I think that's also an opportunity when we have innovations coming into the aviation industry. We have an opportunity to do it right from the beginning, rather than trying to fix something that's not working as it should anymore.
Chris, for all of the aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience, what's it like to do business with airports and airlines? How are they as a customer?
I mean, I personally think it's exciting. As in anything, it has pros and cons, right? I think in this industry, there's a lot of enthusiasts. And if you're an aviation enthusiast yourself, that will be nice to work with other people who are as enthusiastic about aircraft and planes and airports as you are. So that's definitely something I really enjoy. Maybe on the other side, it is a somewhat traditional industry. And to change things, it does require persistence and does require some time. That will be an advice to at least be prepared for that, because it doesn't have to be a problem as long as you expect it and cater for it.
Chris, funny, I was talking to an airline board member recently, and he reminded me of something as it relates to selling to airlines. And I think it's probably something that is really important for our advanced air mobility customers to know. They're probably experiencing as we speak. But when you sell to airlines and you claim they can improve a process, which is something you claim, right? You've done, they will always have more data than you. And these are data-driven organizations. And these are some of the smartest people on the planet with this data. So this is a really smart, informed customer who's been doing it for 50 years. So selling to an airline, as you're experiencing, and with your success, you must be good at what you do. And so when you have an advanced air mobility company, the Joby, the Archers, and others who want to work with the airline, and some of them, the airline is their direct customer, and you claim that you can lower their costs or improve the experience and the like, you're dealing with extraordinarily informed people. I assume you've experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see very big differences in sort of how digital ready an airline or airport is. And it makes it really hard to work with some that are not. On one side, just on the vision and the understanding of the opportunity and the potential, but also on the very practical level, where flight data to know which aircraft we're looking at, how is that being shared? Are APIs in place that can easily be set up? Or do we have to make super traditional, very effort intensive other sorts of integration? So there's really big differences both on the practical as well as on the visionary front. And I mean, I look forward to work more and more with innovative companies that basically come from a mindset of technology and data. And I think in that sense, time is with us, because if you look at executives on airports and airlines, they're typically somewhat older, and that's totally fine. And many of them embrace innovation, and they understand that they take the effort to understand how it works and what kind of potential it can bring, or they rely on people who work for them to do that. But there's also some that don't understand and therefore have a barrier to invest in it. And I think over time, that's something that we're already seeing as more and more people that grew up with the internet, that grew up with mobile phones and applications and data, are moving into higher positions. And the discussion becomes easier because we're talking more and more to people who understand what we're trying to do.
Can you generalize or talk a little bit more about this? Is it oftentimes about the individual at airlines or airports that you're having conversations with, or are there other notable differences, whether this is because of regional differences or legacy versus low cost carriers or some other classification and segmentation of the market?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't necessarily see the division sort of versus traditional versus low cost, but geographically, absolutely. So it's very clear for us that North America has a very different culturally a very different stance towards technology and opportunity and entrepreneurship than Europe. North American market is much more driven by opportunity and try things, and also some optimism, I would say, versus where big parts of Europe are much more driven by fear and safety and what if it fails, what if it doesn't work. The innovators and the early adopters are generally well represented in the US and Canada, so North America. And I think the European airports and airlines are looking towards the US market, and that gives them the confidence to see, okay, it works over there, so now we are sort of ready to try it ourselves.
So at the end of the day, you have to follow the money as it relates to the value of what you're offering. And those who will most financially benefit are going to be the ones who are most receptive. I would also, plug the American Airlines. I mean, at the end of the day, the strength of the operational analyst and the leverage of the operational analyst within the airline is almost one-to-one to your success. And if they are being listened to by the senior executives, as in my opinion, most of the major airlines here in the US, they do listen to them, the greater the opportunity for the success there. But at the end of the day, you outlined two things that are really interesting. One is you have to first make the play, and you first have to convince the senior executives of the airline that this is important. Before you even talk about who you are, this is important, and this is the cash you can generate, and this is the improved net promoter score or the customer satisfaction that's going to come from what you do. If you get that, then number two, convincing them that, you may be more effective than somebody else is a whole lot easier. But at the end of the day, expanding your market is getting to, what's the cash that's generated by the airline. And it sounds like, I've learned a lot on this call, it sounds like the US airlines are the ones who are driving the process. And boy, the worst market arguably are those who say, I don't need to improve, and I'm just concerned about not making a mistake. That's not the most attractive market for you, it sounds like.
This is a thought that literally just popped up in my head. I think one of the reasons for this difference in behavior, besides being culture driven, might also be competition, right? I think many of the European airlines, they come from a position where they were a national carrier, right? And so they were basically, to a certain extent at least, a monopoly for a very long period of time. And I think within the US, just because of the sheer size of the market, the airlines come from more of a competitive background and therefore have a bigger drive for innovation, for efficiency, because they know if they don't, it's going to be punished, right? Whereas KLM's or Lufthansa's, for very long periods of time, that competitive pressure wasn't there, only until sort of the open skies agreements came in place and actually some competition was invited into the industry.
The other thing I got to say, the whole conversation with Luca and Peter around Formula One, going from whatever it was, 60-second turn to 2-second turns. What a great opportunity for you and for, improving the financial bottom line for the airlines. Wow, over the next couple of years. And like I said, I think on the advanced air mobility front, those who are going to operate their vehicles, that turn will be a very big deal. So I assume that's going to be a good market for you and others as well.
Well, certainly. And, in the airline scenario, the choices we have compared to Formula One are kind of limited because you have to work within the existing infrastructure. You can't completely overhaul what the gate looks like. But looking ahead to high-scale drone operations or other types of advanced air mobility, the operators have more vertical control of what that stack looks like. And arguably, the flight density and the pace is going to be much higher. And there's going to be this huge impetus to make greater and greater utilization of the assets because, especially in passenger mobility, the asset utilization of a vertiport is never going to equal that of a modern airport in terms of, passengers per day relative to the infrastructure. So there's a lot of demand for it. And, as you look ahead into that mode, a lot of options to really architect for throughput and for leveraging technology such as this to manage it.
Yeah. So in some ways, you're not in the business of gate turns. You optimize assets or asset utilization. I mean, maybe that'll make people a little more aware of the value of what you do. And as Peter said, Chris, you have the optimization of the drone. You have the optimization of the eVTOL. That fast turn has enormous value.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
If you fast forward 5-10 years, what does the industry look like? When are we going to get closer to Formula One as it relates to asset utilization?
I think there's a natural pressure for it to move that way. And 5 to 10 years, it will look different. I'm convinced of that. We tend to underestimate what we can do in the long term, whereas we overestimate what we do in the short term. And I think if you look at the forecast of how many people are, want to fly and how many more people will be able to afford flying, the pressures are going to be there in order to make sure these efficiencies find their ways there. And part of these efficiencies are also totally new innovations like drones and personal flight. On the other hand, I also believe and honestly hope that the industry is also going to become more sustainable. That will maybe take a little bit more time than 5 to 10 years, but I think there's also already a lot that can be done within 5 to 10 years. Because we're often talking about the electric flight or hydrogen flight, which are really big opportunities with a huge impact. But I think we'll have a long timeline. And I think even if we look at the way we do things today, there's already a lot of opportunity to improve and at least make flying a bit more sustainable so that people don't need to feel bad to learn what other cultures are like or what other countries look like, because I think there's a lot of value in that.
We often ask what advice would you give to somebody starting a business in advanced air mobility. Let me change it a little bit. What advice would you give to somebody who wants to start a business in selling to technology to airlines and airports, and recognizing that a lot of what they'd be doing also may apply to advanced air mobility?
I'd say bring some patience for sure, but I would also say show people. I think in order to change something, people need to see it. Seeing is believing. And, we invested quite a bit to show what can be achieved. And it's a stepped approach as well. So not everyone will come at once, because some people, like we discussed before, are innovators and they will be believers and they will go with you from day one. And you need to work with those people to show the early adopters what can be achieved. And you need to work with those people to show, the early majority, to show them how safe it is or how secure it actually is, which takes away their specific concerns. So really look at your target group, split it up, work with the innovators, show what can be achieved to sort of unlock the next cohort of potential customers. That's I think, a nice piece of advice that I would give.
What's the common misconception when it comes to addressing aviation capacity bottlenecks?
I would say that, the most common misconception is that there's just one solution, and that's build more capacity. That's the traditional solution for the problem. And there's other ways. And sometimes it's difficult because, building a new terminal, building new piers, building new gates and aircraft stands, it's nice. And many people come from this sort of SimCity mindset, right? Like we built this huge airport and architects and everything. But I think there is, as we discussed, there's other ways, and efficiency is definitely part of the other solutions. And it's not just, we cannot just solve capacity issues by building more capacity.
At the end of the day, if there's a river of cash of opportunity here, the kind of work that you're doing in improving asset utilization is the low-hanging fruit. I'll also add, you're probably the low-hanging fruit as it relates to sustainability as well. When a plane sits out there for 15 minutes, as you were saying, Chris, and that those engines are running, rather than the power that's at the gate. Come on, I mean, you're affecting some real things today, and you're doing it as we speak, as opposed to, others that are sometimes in advanced air mobility that someday I may reduce, I may improve sustainability, I may improve the environment, I may be able to have an effect on profit. You're doing it today, or the area that you're in, you're doing today. So wrap up this bad dog. How would you summarize the podcast, and what do you want to leave with our guests?
Thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Like I said at the beginning, it's nice to work with people who have an intrinsic interest and enthusiasm about aviation. And I believe that was apparent in the conversation we had today. We need to be positive, optimistic about what we can achieve. There is a lot of low-hanging fruit. There's bigger changes to come. And we need people to believe in that and to put their efforts and energies into that in order to keep this industry as exciting as it is.
Well, we're glad you're doing what you're doing, and other companies as well, Chris. So thanks for being on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.